Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Resource Gatherer. I'm your host, Justin Hayward. With me today is our guest star, Cody. He's back. We're going to be talking again about One Piece, this time diving more into the anime side than the D&D homebrew side. As always, check out our content. We're going to try to release content every other Friday. Every Friday, ideally, but every other Friday if we can't make it. But yeah, moving forward, I think this is going to be more of the setup that we're going to be looking for. Hopefully, we'll be able to bring Shades on back into the fold. He's just been really busy right now. So, on that note, let's go ahead and dive into this episode of Resource Gatherer. So, last week we talked about how One Piece and your One Piece homebrew adaptation sort of works into the anime world. Let's dive into One Piece itself and the live action that just dropped on Netflix. So, what are your thoughts on this live action? What do you think they got right?
Well, they definitely got it right with choosing the right characters, like based upon like what they are in the show.
You mean the cast members?
Like the cast members. Like I felt like they did a very good job, like just like their physical aspects of it to like just how they look, how they act, how they sound, because like when you watch like these animes, like whether you watch them like in the original sub or dub, you kind of develop these things. And for me, that was a big shock at first, like listen to like Luffy with like that Hispanic accent.
Yeah, because his character, from what Oda has said, is supposed to be from Brazil. So hearing the either the Japanese audio or the American audio, especially if you've been watching One Piece since Funimation,
Yeah,
there's a very specific style to his voice. So yeah, I could completely see that shock. But I do agree. I think that the casting was really well done. I think a lot of those elements they got right. What else do you think that they got right about the live action?
So for the live action, like they definitely focused on the bigger points of everything. Like they omitted some of the smaller things. Like there was no Django on Syrup Village. There was no Don Krieg. Don Krieg was in for 30 seconds when Mihawk like messed him up in the Bratier episode.
Yeah.
So like they omitted the minor details of stuff because like Don Krieg is not really important.
Yeah, and I could, so they do mention him and they do bring him in. I do think it's interesting they brought Mihawk in as early as they did. I was a little surprised they brought him in beating up Don Krieg, because we see that flashback, which is like way later that Don Krieg got beat up by Mihawk. But it's interesting that they used the full story that Oda had already built and sort of were able to fill in the audience the background information rather than being like, okay, here's how it started, here's how it went. I think... I agree. I think that those elements made a lot of sense, especially when you're shooting it, like you said in the last episode, like 65 episodes in 8 episodes.
Yeah.
Granted, they were an hour and a half long.
But I mean, that's still way less time than it is for an entire, 65 episodes that are like 20 minutes apiece.
Yeah, and I do think it's going to be interesting. I think that the characters that they developed obviously made the most sense for live action adaptation. Because they're all human actors. But once we start getting into the later seasons, obviously things like Chopper, and the other crew members, I do think that that's where it's going to be interesting to see how the CGI holds up in comparison to the traditional anime. I think that a lot of
I think Brooke's going to be really impressive. Like he's going to be bad.
Yeah. So, or Frankie even Frankie will be Frankie's supposed to be like 10 feet tall or something. Like,
yeah, he's huge. Well, because when before the time skip, he looks pretty average.
Yeah.
But post time skip, the dude is stacked.
Yeah. And so that's going to be really interesting too, is whenever they go pre time skip versus post time skip, because everything post time skip gets even crazier, because that's when you start getting into,
hockey and everything else like that.
Yeah. And adding in those elements. I'm curious though if you think that they're going to start adding in the idea of hockey early on in the series comparatively to the actual anime, because I know Oda really hadn't thought about hockey as something that was really there until probably the later stages of the series. So do you think that as a developer they're going to be like, oh hey, we should symbolize that certain characters are going to have hockey, because Oda does trickle in the idea that it's possible, for example, Usopp being able to have observation hockey whenever he's on the when they're at the prison, whenever they're, what I'm talking about,
Enies Lobby.
Yeah, Enies Lobby, where he's literally like shoots like this flame bolt or whatever for like a mile or something crazy.
Yeah, I mean, like I definitely think like we've talked about before is like Oda doesn't do anything without another reason behind it. You know, like there is no such thing as just a filler episode with him. You know, and you go to so many minor details because, like, you know, spoiler alert for anyone that doesn't.
Oh, this whole episode's a spoiler. I'm sorry. If you haven't ever watched One Piece, you probably should have stayed home today.
And watch One Piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Go home, watch One Piece, think about your actions, come back, listen to this episode.
But, like, think about the first time Luffy gets his Gum Gum powers.
Oh, yeah.
And he's in the ocean, and Shanks saves him, gets his arm torn off by that big sea monster, and he looks at him and says, "Get out of here," and that thing runs away. So Shanks has, like, some form of Conqueror's Haki or something like that.
But the thing is that Luffy was unable to observe it as Haki.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that he's always had the idea that there was going to be hidden powers, but he may not have named it. For example, like literally air jumping, like that was huge. That was huge when Sanji got that ability.
Oh, it was amazing.
But he didn't know that was a Haki ability. Like that was what was crazy about it. Whenever you see Sanji literally just jumping in the air, copying what he had seen. So I do think that what they got right was they focused on the crucial elements of the story that matter to a larger audience who maybe hasn't seen One Piece.
Mm-hmm.
I
like
think
my wife was a person, like she's seen me watch the anime and stuff like that, and she's not an anime person. But then she watched the trailer for the live action, and she's a big live action person. Like that's what she likes. And we watched it, and she was like, "I can't wait for season 2 to come out for this." I'm like, "This is awesome."
So how do you think it's compared to its counterparts, the other live action adaptations of anime series in the recent years?
I mean, for me, it stands alone. I mean, like the Avatar one, that was garbage.
Yeah.
The Dragon Ball, that was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like a lot of those ones, like they try, but I think the reason why this one was so much more successful was because Oda told them from the get-go, "I have final say, I have final rights. If I don't like it, we pull it."
Yeah, and I think
and other people they're like, "Well, we just want to do a live action because we think it'd be cool and the fans like it," and then the fans get all hyped and they like overhype themselves for it. And then it's like, and then it just kind of like tumbles down real quick.
Yeah, I would say that I agree with all the points you made about the animes that haven't done well. I will say that the Full Metal Alchemist one arguably did really well. I think that it stuck to the traditional story. Even though the CGI wasn't as good as it could have been, I do think that it was done well on the budget they were provided. I would argue that that's probably... So this is probably the second anime that I think has done well. And I would say that if we didn't think about Full Metal Alchemist and like the hard work it basically had to put in to say, hey, this is important, I don't think we would get there. Now, see, my worry, and this is just something I've sort of been thinking about, the superhero age is dying. It's been on a decline for the past, 5 years, really since Endgame ended.
Yeah.
That was the end of the superhero era in large stream media. And so my worry is that anime is going to become the new superheroes. What are your thoughts on the idea that these big budget studios like Marvel or DC or really Disney and Sony, because they're the ones who own these companies, take over this anime live action space?
So like obviously the big worries are if they ruin the stories. They omit stuff because they don't know anything about it and they go, "Oh, I don't think that's important." And then that's like a super key detail. Like my favorite thing in One Piece is Laboon. When they're going up Reverse Mountain and they meet Laboon, you think it's like, oh, just some random whale hanging out with this dude waiting on some pirates. Well, then later on, when you find out Brook was that pirate crew and that his goal is to get back to Laboon and they've already met Laboon, like mind blown at that one, and that's like something I could see, like, one of these big budget companies that, are like, "Oh, well, it's not that big a deal." Well, no, that's actually a huge deal. Now, how are you going to backplay, because you can't backpedal that. You can't skip that and then backpedal to it. So my issue is I think that what they do on the screen will be done right. My problem is very much similar to the Marvel universe. And we could dive into that in a later episode. Yeah.
Essentially, my issue is that these big budget studios only have a 2-hour window to tell an audience who has no idea about this character, to introduce them, to make them care, and to develop their story. And to do that, they're not necessarily going to have to follow the traditional archetype of the comics or the manga or etc. for example, as we stated with One Piece, I don't think would have done as well as a live action movie. I think that especially if they tried to fit as much as they did in that 2, even 3, 4 hour mark window, it would have taken away from the way that the studio was doing it. And so I think that moving forward, television really is going to be the prime way that these stories should be adapted. And I think that that's where a lot of remakes are starting to happen. Like a lot of Harry Potter fans loved the movies, but hated a lot of the elements that they got wrong or missed from the books. And so I could see that very much being in the play where like Harry Potter is eventually going to be becoming that new live action they're looking at developing.
Well, think of it like Game of Thrones. What if they tried to do an entire book into a movie?
Exactly. And that's why I was saying, I don't think certain mediums tend to go well into these, especially these long arcing story mediums tend to go well into these short-term formats. Granted, some stories make sense, but I do think that that's going to be the issue we're going to run into when these big box office studios start buying up the content for these animes and these series, is how do we create stories that are going to be interesting? I will say that, for example, like the Mario movie that just dropped recently, I think they did a really good job of showcasing how Mario became Mario.
Yeah.
And I do think that moving forward, that could be really well done. But that was a 2-hour glimpse into who Mario is. Now, how are they going to showcase the continuum of Mario's story? And how are they going to introduce all of the rest of the Sega characters, for example? We don't know.
Yeah.
And how do you do that in those 2-hour budgets if we relate that back to the live action adaptations? For example, the X-Men, right? You see these small glimpses into the OG X-Men movies. The X-Men is really what started this Marvel wave of live action adaptations. When we go back to like OG 2000s, X-Men and Spider-Man were the two biggest franchises that really brought up the idea of what made live action even possible. And then, you know, because of their success, that was where Iron Man and where Marvel really was able to dive themselves out of this hole where they were in debt, and that's why they had to sell themselves to Disney.
Yeah. Well, and then the biggest thing is to look at, you know, like, not that size matters or anything like that, but when you look at an X-Men comic or an Iron Man comic or a Spider-Man comic, they're this big.
Yeah, roughly 18 to 22 pages is I think somewhere around there is. I could be wrong.
And to span an hour and a half, 2-hour movie out of that is not that difficult to get all the details that you're supposed to get in that happen in that story for like the diehard fans or for the people that are just getting into it and they go, okay, this is actually really cool. But then you go into something like One Piece where one manga book is, you know, 2 inches thick, or Harry Potter, which is, you know, 1,000 pages, you know, different things like that. To squeeze that much information into a 2.5 hour movie, that's difficult. But by switching from that 2-hour movie, like longer movie block, into like a series, like a TV series, like you were saying, I think that's a way smarter way to do this. Because one, the best thing that Oda did with this live action is he took time in almost every episode, whenever a new character came around, to divulge the information of why they are the way they are. You know, Usopp with his mom, and, you know, Luffy actually meeting Yasopp, like, you know, because he's a member of Shanks' crew.
And the fact that they addressed that so early on, because that was like information we knew as the audience, but I don't know it was necessarily explained that Luffy knew Yasopp, you know, his dad early on in the series. It's like, oh yeah, they kind of mentioned it, but that was it. There wasn't like a lot of devolving into that sort of arc. It was just like, oh hey, you knew my dad. That's sweet. And they do talk about it in the anime because I'm rewatching One Piece actually, and they do show it inside of the Syrup Island arc. And I do love that, like when you see it from like the live action and then you go back and rewatch it on the anime, you're like, I could see that exact moment where they have that like, oh, so you do know my dad. That's weird that you would know him and that you were able to have that adventure with him.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that makes it so cool because like there are so many full circle effects that just come around and stuff like that. Like after Arlong, and then when they go to the Sea People Kingdom.
Oh, yeah.
And Arlong was a guy that was cast out from them, from the Sun Pirates and everything like that. Because they didn't really, like, you saw his Sun Pirate tattoo, like, in the live action, but that didn't mean anything to anybody. You just think it's a regular tattoo.
Yeah, and I do think that that's going to be, like we were saying, I think that's going to be the biggest drawback, I think, when one of these big studios picks up one of these series and they think they can pick it up. For example, Dragon Ball Z has already been done.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do it in segments, right? Like if you're going to do a movie, if they were going to do a DBZ movie, they either start off with Dragon Ball or they skip straight to Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, you can't do either, but Dragon Ball is the fundamental principles of Dragon Ball Z.
So ideally, if Disney or Sony or one of these big studios started it, they were going to start with Dragon Ball. Now the question is do they make Dragon Ball a single movie, or would they make it into a trilogy?
I mean, it's 5 seasons. I mean, like there's like 150 some episodes, and there's 3 tournaments.
Yeah,
that go through the Red Ribbon Army. I mean, there is a lot of aspects in there. I mean, the Mercenary Tau, climbing Korin Tower. Like I love the Dragon Ball series. Like that is, to me, the original before they get all crazy and superpowers. Like, don't get me wrong, Z, Super Saiyans, awesomeness. But the core principles, like you can make an entire, movie based upon Goku going to the first tournament.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So it's like, but if they were to if these big corporations were instead of looking to make big blockbuster movie specials and were to move away into these television style shows, that's easily, 4 or 5 seasons alone. Like you said, they could break it up each season of the show. They could break that into each season of the actual live action. And we could see a very different style shoot. And that's really what I think would be really important moving forward as we sort of see this progression of, moving away from the superhero world. And obviously it seems like anime is going to be the next big takeover. You can see like big executives looking at like, how do we cash in the next cow, right? That was where we had like early 2000s was superheroes. And then it kind of devolved into the next big cash cow was the trilogy series of books. That's where you got your Maze Runners, your,
Harry Potter continued on. Like that one was like midway through Lord of the Rings. They were finishing up that stuff. Then they dove into The Hobbit later on, like different things like that, which are all successful, which is one of the big things I actually argue with my buddy all the time. Not so much argue, we argue other people, that Marvel does fantastic movies. Okay. Iron Man, Spider-Man, X-Men, all those guys. They do fantastic movies. DC, though, does better TV shows.
DC does better anime adaptations of movies, though. I will say that if I put any DC animated movie up against any of the live action Marvel movies, I would 100% watch the DC animated movie over the Marvel movie. And there's one critical reason. DC animated movies are dark and meant for an adult audience.
Yeah.
Marvel movies are built for a larger general audience. Now, I'm not saying that Marvel movies are bad. I love Marvel movies. I love to laugh. I love the action. I love the adventure. And some of those early adaptations are great. But if we were to pick apart every single Marvel movie, there's bad eggs. For example, Iron Man 1 was great. But if you look at Captain America 1 sucked.
But it was more of a backstory of everything that led into, because I mean, like Civil War was awesome.
Yeah, and I do think that they got a lot of the elements that I didn't like in Civil War. Like I think they cheated it by making it into a movie. And that again, because
I agree.
You talked about how comics are these 18 to 22 pages, but that's per volume. If we were to look at it comparing to the manga editions that you were discussing, we would take each of these volumes and we'd stack them into the actual book of the series. So like Civil War, for example, is a huge novel chunk that could be on comparable size to the One Piece that we were discussing before.
And it was a longer movie and everything like that to get it to be.
So it's like if they would have swapped this live action Marvel adaptation and they had done it rather as a series, like for example, like they were doing with Loki and like they did with,
She-Hulk and other things like that.
Or WandaVision. I think like WandaVision was probably one of the better ones that they did, as well as Loki. If they had gone that route with Civil War, I think doing that episodic style, it could have had a better approach to those larger archetypes. I know that that's what they're trying to do now with like Secret Wars. They're moving away from large, big budget movies, and they're trying to dissect their stories of how they want to start telling stories.
Because people want the details. We want to be able to like immerse ourselves into it, and you kind of want to see, and like no one really goes to the movies anymore. That is a dying field. But if they're all on these platforms, like everybody and their brother has a platform. You got Disney, you got Netflix, you got Hulu, you get, everything in its brother. And animes, I mean, most of these shows have been going on for years, decades, even some of them. And people are always excited when the new art comes out, the new set comes out, the new anything comes out, and they watch it in the convenience of their home, because how many people have time to go watch a 3-hour movie in the movie theater nowadays?
I think it's less about time and more about convenience.
Yeah.
I think that going back to like one of the things you said, details matter.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to something you've said earlier in the podcast, those little details and nuances that people attach themselves. For example, you and this whale, right, from One Piece.
Dude, Laboon is key, man.
Exactly. So like you and Laboon, right? If that is your like, if that's all you want to see in the live action and that's the only thing you care about, and you're not the only one who thinks that way, there's diehard fans just like us who are like, this is all I want out of this specific topic, regardless of the live action medium that it's coming from. I think that it needs to have the details that we want as fans.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that do it well have done it well. And really, I think that even though we sort of started this episode more talking about One Piece, this has devolved exclusively into live action adaptations, which is what I think we're going to title this episode moving forward. So with that in mind, I think if we look at other products that people haven't been as happy with, let's talk about, for example, there's the other Netflix adaptation where Henry Cavill's leaving, The Witcher.
Yeah.
The Witcher was huge where people are like, okay, why would fans not enjoy this? And the answer to that is a general audience doesn't know what the fans of these franchises do well. They don't understand why audience members are getting mad. They're like, why are you getting mad? Because they're skipping key details. Now, if we switch that over to The Last of Us, which literally did a shot-for-shot representation of some of the most famous scenes from that game, we can go, oh my gosh, look what you can do versus what you did. And I think that that's really what audiences at home have really started devolving into, is just like, we have a certain expectation that we want from these, these products that we've invented into. Like, for example, if they ever did that new game, Baldur's Gate 3 that just dropped, there's so many fans.
Have you heard of that one?
Oh yeah, sorry. We're just going to name drop that slight little thing there. If that ever became like a product that was developed into, say, a series, do you think they would do a movie series or a television series for a product like that?
I mean, smart money would be a TV series, but it really depends on the person. I mean, because like we talked about, like all the fans that watch these shows, we know the details. We've rewatched this show knowing what to look for, and you look for those foreshadowing things. But then when you have Joe Schmo over here just comes in out of left field and goes, hey, I think this looks cool. I watched most of it. They don't know enough of it, and they don't have those fans and those core base to get people to make sure like, hey, this is a really important detail. We need you to pay attention to it. So when you get the creator of something that's going to like put their time, because it's their name on it.
Yeah.
Oda's put almost 1,100 episodes into One Piece, and he said he's about a third of the way done. He is not going to let something come out
Oh no,
that's going to misrepresent and upset him and ruin all his hard work.
But on the flip side, Oda's in a very unique position that not a lot of people have, which is Oda could quit writing today and arguably have enough money to live off his residuals that he's made for the rest of his life. Will he ever do that? No. But he could. Now, I'm not saying this to be like pragmatic. Not everyone has that same advantage whenever it comes to the products that they're creating. For example, Ready Player One. Ready Player One, the guy who created that series, obviously wanted the actor who inspired the majority of the product, Spielberg, to direct the film.
Yeah.
And when Spielberg directed the film, which was an homage to his book, is an homage to Spielberg's, career. Mm-hmm. Spielberg was like, yeah, I don't want to incorporate any of the elements from my stories into this to basically be like, look what I did. So it's like almost as if someone who loves Spielberg as much as the writer of that series should have done it, and it could have had a completely different outcome. Because first off, I loved that book. It was one of my favorite books. And the live adaptation just fell so flat in comparison. Granted, it was still okay, but I think that they could have developed more. And that's really what I think moving forward with live actions in general, how we should be looking at the product. We as the fans can dictate and change things. If you don't believe me, look at what we did to Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah. Oh.
Sonic the Hedgehog was going to be a box office disaster. And we as the fans said, no, that is not what we want. This is how you fix it. And the studio said, yes, dear, and fixed it.
Yeah.
And because of that, I supported Sonic. I watched the second one. If there's a third one, a fourth one, a fifth one, as long as they continue to do what the fans want, I will always support that studio because they made the critical decision to change something that was terrible when received terribly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what you have to do as a director, as a producer. Even if it costs you money on the front end, don't try to cheat it. And one of the areas they've tried to cheat it in the past is obviously CGI.
Yeah.
And so obviously you want to give products to your audience as quickly as possible, but don't cheat it. Like, what is it? The Game of Thrones, House of Dragons season 2. I don't think that it's going to come out for like another 2, probably longer than that, years now because of the writer's strike. But ultimately, writers should be able to write what they want, that the fans know that they want. So getting the right type of writers on these products,
because they've been writing for so long, they know what their fans want.
Yeah.
You know, someone that doesn't write it is like, oh, we should do this, and they're like, well, no, because it's hard enough to like do a presentation. Like I compare it to doing a presentation at your school. You know, you have an audience of 30 people that have no clue what you're talking about because you did a book report on some random thing. Well, imagine doing that for 10 million people that know everything about what you're presenting. Now you're going to look like a big fool if you don't do it right.
Yeah, and I would say that the biggest issue I think that they're going to run into moving forward, and we can relate this back to the original starting point of the topic, which was One Piece. When it comes to getting elements correct that audience members enjoy and seeing changes, we as an audience and as a fan base are willing to accept change if the elements we want correctly done are done well.
Yes. I agree with
For
that.
example, because they got the characters right, because they got the right feel, even the audience, like even the cast members for this show were all specifically chosen because they're all One Piece fans. Henry Cavill was a huge like Witcher fan and got like booted off because he was a huge Witcher fan. It should have been the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, the guy who does he voices Darth Maul in like the animations and stuff. He also did like the Revenge. He was like the apprentice for Darth Maul. Like he's been doing like Star Wars stuff forever. The reason he got put in that role is because he was a fan. He was a super fan. And even the directors were like, oh my gosh, this dude knows what he's talking about. Those are the type of people that should be in this role. Those roles, those are the ones who should be cast. People who know the content, know what the character is, know what to expect. And the people on these casts should be focusing on that as well. And I hopefully hope that moving forward, these big studio execs will continue to create live actions that us as an audience will want.
I agree. Because, I mean, the best thing you can do is get somebody that you're going to direct and show that understands what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
You know? I mean, you imagine talking to some random big-name Hollywood actor that you're going to have to do this, and they have zero clue about anything on this one.
And they were just chosen because they were Chris Pratt.
Hey, man, Chris Pratt's funny, but...
Oh, no, I think that a lot of people hated on him for Mario, and they thought he was going to do bad. But in the original clip, when they show him doing his Mario accent, he put the time and work in to do the voice, and he has voice acting experience. Mm-hmm. But everyone was like, oh, you chose him because he's Chris Pratt or he's Tom Holland or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But if they can do the job and they can do the job well, I don't care whose face or voice it is. Granted, it could have been betterly done with someone who maybe originated that voice, but that is here nor there. And on that note, we're going to go ahead and end this week's episode. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you guys for listening and hope you learned a little bit more about our takes on live actions.